It all started with a whisper, not in the literal sense, but in the way intuition tickles the edge of consciousness. I'd always believed in my marriage. 11 years of partnership with Ethan hadn't been perfect, but it felt strong enough to withstand the usual tempests of life. We had weathered financial ups and downs, celebrated the arrival of 2 boys, and navigated the labyrinth of married life. And then, a small whisper turned into a persistent scream. It began one Saturday evening. Ethan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He was upstairs helping our youngest, Jamie, prepare for bed. Without thinking, I glanced at the screen. It was a simple message, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," face blowing a kiss, from an unsaved number. My heart plummeted, but I didn't act immediately. Instead, I waited. I smiled as Ethan came downstairs and kissed my forehead like nothing was amiss. He chatted about work, joked with our older son, Ryan, about his upcoming soccer match, and settled in front of the TV. I didn't mention the message, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, when Ethan fell asleep, I reached for his phone. I'd never done it before. I hated the idea of invading someone's privacy. But the gnawing suspicion outweighed my hesitations. I unlocked his phone, a password I had long known but never used for this purpose. My fingers trembled as I scrolled. There they were. A string of messages, playful and flirty. They weren't from a casual acquaintance or a friend. They were unmistakably intimate. I didn't recognize the name, Sophia. My stomach turned over, my breathing shallow. The messages weren't limited to texts. There were calls, long ones. Pictures exchanged. Plans to meet. In one thread, Ethan had written, "You're the only one who gets me. I can't wait to start a real future together." A real future. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down. By morning, I had decided on my course of action. I wasn't going to stew in silence. The next day, while Ethan took Ryan to his game, I called the number saved under Sophia. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright and unfamiliar. "Hello?" "Hi, Sophia. This is Ethan's wife." The pause on the other end told me everything. She knew. After a few moments, her voice quavered. I didn't know he was married." I tightened my grip on the phone. "You didn't?" The incredulity in my voice was sharp. "No," she sounded defensive now. "He told me he was divorced, with kids. We'd been seeing each other for months, but I swear, he said he was single." Months. My legs gave out, and I sank into the nearest chair. "What else did he tell you?" The conversation that followed unraveled everything I thought I knew. Ethan hadn't just lied to me, he'd constructed an alternate life. With Sophia, he was a man who had moved on from a failed marriage, who was ready to love again. He had told her he was looking for a house near her city. They had been planning for the future. A future without me. As Ethan and Ryan returned home that evening, the air was charged. I could barely meet Ethan's eyes, yet I wore a mask of calm. The house was quiet, the boys occupied, and Ethan seemed oblivious to the storm brewing within me. It wasn't until the kids were asleep that I confronted him. "Who's Sophia?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the rage simmering beneath. Ethan froze. His fork hovered mid-air, the color draining from his face. "What are you talking about?" "I spoke to her today," I said, placing my phone on the table. "She thinks you're divorced." "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at me like a man caught in a spotlight. It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I snapped. "You've been seeing her, building a relationship with her, while living under my roof and pretending everything is fine." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's complicated, Mia." "No, it's simple." My voice cracked. "You lied to me." To her. You've been building a life with someone else while tearing mine apart. For the first time in 11 years, I saw Ethan as a stranger. Someone capable of this level of betrayal. Someone I didn't know. But the unexpected twist, the thing that would haunt me, hadn't even happened yet. Ethan was uncharacteristically quiet as I spoke, his head bowed, fingers knotted together. For a man who usually had a quick defense for every situation, he looked more like a cornered animal than my husband of 11 years. You need to start talking, Ethan, I demanded, my voice sharp enough to cut through his silence. Mia, he began, his voice a near whisper, I never meant for this to happen. I couldn't believe the cliché spilling from his lips. I wanted to scream. Instead, I folded my arms across my chest, steadying myself for the rest of the truth. Explain it to me, then, I said coldly. How do you not mean to cheat on your wife and lie to another woman about being married? He exhaled deeply, rubbing his palms over his face. At first, it was harmless. Just flirting. It made me feel alive again. I felt a sharp stab in my chest. Alive again. Like our life, our family, wasn't enough for him. When did it stop being harmless? He didn't meet my gaze. A few months ago. It wasn't supposed to go this far, Mia. I swear, Stop swearing. It means nothing now. My voice cracked, but I refused to cry in front of him. Do you love her? He flinched, and that single hesitation was answer enough. My knees felt weak, but I kept my composure. That's all I needed to know. Mia, please. It's not like that. You don't get to tell me what it's like, Ethan. Not anymore. I turned on my heel and left him sitting there, his words chasing me as I climbed the stairs. In our bedroom, I closed the door behind me, sinking onto the bed that now felt alien. This was where we'd shared laughter, dreams, and whispered conversations late into the night. Now it felt like a battleground. But the war wasn't over yet. The next morning, Ethan was up early, making breakfast for the boys as if everything was normal. His ability to compartmentalize was almost impressive, but I saw through it. I could feel his eyes on me as I entered the kitchen, but I ignored him, focusing on pouring myself coffee. Mom, can we go to the park after breakfast? Ryan asked, his bright, innocent face reminding me why I couldn't fall apart. Sure, sweetheart, I said, brushing his hair back. Jamie clapped his hands in delight, his smile tugging at the edges of my broken heart. Ethan cleared his throat. I thought maybe we could all go together. My laugh was bitter and sharp. A family outing, Ethan? Really? His shoulders slumped, but he didn't argue. He was smart enough to know that any attempt at normalcy was futile. After breakfast, I took the boys to the park alone. Watching them play, I tried to focus on the sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of their laughter. But my mind kept circling back to Ethan, to Sophia, to the web of lies he'd spun. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophia. Can we meet? There's something you need to know. My stomach twisted. What more could she possibly have to say? But curiosity, or maybe masochism, got the better of me. We met later that afternoon at a coffee shop in the next town over. Sophia looked nervous, her hands gripping her cup as she sat across from me. She was younger than I'd expected, with bright eyes that hinted at the naivete Ethan had undoubtedly exploited. Thank you for meeting me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Just tell me what you needed to say, I replied, my patience thin. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the table. I thought you deserved to know that he wasn't honest with me either. I raised an eyebrow. About what? I found out yesterday that I'm not the only one. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What are you talking about? She pulled out her phone, scrolling before sliding it across the table. On the screen was a thread of messages, Ethan's name at the top. But these weren't her messages. They were from someone named Leah. He's been seeing her too, Sophia said, her voice trembling. For a year. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as rage and disbelief coursed through me. A year. While I was raising our boys, holding our family together, he'd been juggling not one, but two affairs. I confronted him last night, Sophia continued. He told me it was over, that she didn't mean anything. But I thought you should know. The betrayal deepened, the layers more intricate than I could have imagined. Thank you for telling me, I said, standing abruptly. Mia. I didn't wait for her to finish. I walked out of the coffee shop, my head spinning. When I got home, Ethan was sitting in the living room, pretending to read. He looked up as I entered, his face unreadable. Ethan, I said, my voice steady but cold. Who is Leah? His reaction was instant, his face drained of color, and the book slipped from his hands. Answer me, I demanded. He stammered, searching for words. I can explain. But I wasn't interested in explanations anymore. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a calculated, deliberate dismantling of everything we had built. And I wasn't going to let him walk away from it unscathed. Ethan's face was a pale canvas of guilt and desperation. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if he even knew who he was lying to anymore. Himself? Me? Sophia? Leah? The sheer web he had woven made my stomach turn. Who is Leah? I repeated, enunciating each word as if I were speaking to a child. Mia, I was going to tell you. When? I snapped. After she moved into our guest room? After you replaced me entirely? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing like a trapped animal. Leah it's complicated. I crossed my arms, the heat of my anger making my hands tremble. Stop hiding behind that word, Ethan. Nothing about this is complicated. You lied. You cheated. And now you're caught. Start talking. He stopped pacing and slumped into the armchair, his head in his hands. Leah is someone I met at work. It started, innocently. She needed someone to talk to. Her marriage was falling apart. I let out a hollow laugh. Oh, the irony. Did you bond over shared infidelity? His head shot up, his eyes pleading. It wasn't like that. I never wanted to hurt you. Or the kids. Don't you dare bring the kids into this, I hissed. You didn't care about hurting them when you started sleeping with other women. I made a mistake, he said weakly. No, I countered, leaning closer. You made a choice. Over and over again, you chose to lie, to cheat, to betray your family. And now you get to live with the consequences. He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. Save it, Ethan. I've heard enough. I turned and walked out, leaving him to stew in his guilt. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, images of Ethan with these women danced through my mind. Memories of our life together played like a cruel montage, now tainted by his betrayal. At some point, exhaustion won. When I woke the next morning, the house was eerily quiet. I found a note on the kitchen counter in Ethan's handwriting. Mia, I'm staying at a hotel for a few days to give you space. I'll be in touch about the kids. I'm sorry. Sorry. The word felt so insignificant, a pebble against the avalanche of damage he'd caused. The days passed in a blur. I threw myself into caring for Ryan and Jamie, trying to shield them from the cracks forming in their world. Ethan texted sporadically, checking in about the boys but saying little else. Then, one evening, as I was folding laundry, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Hi, Mia. This is Leah. I think we need to talk. We met the next afternoon in a small cafe. Leah was nothing like Sophia, older, polished, with an air of confidence that immediately put me on edge. Thank you for meeting me, she said as I sat down. Cut to the chase, I said, not in the mood for pleasantries. Why are you here? She studied me for a moment before leaning forward. Because I think you deserve to know the truth. My stomach churned. The truth about what? About Ethan. About why he's been doing this. I raised an eyebrow. I think I've got a pretty clear picture already. Do you? She asked, tilting her head. Did he tell you about his debt? About why he's been desperate for a way out? Her words hit me like a slap. Debt? Leah nodded, her expression grim. He owes a significant amount of money to some very dangerous people. I found out a few months ago. That's why he started seeing me. I blinked, trying to process. He was using you for money? Yes, she said bluntly. And Sophia, too. I didn't know about her until recently, but it makes sense now. He's been stringing us both along, trying to find a way to dig himself out. My head spun. Ethan hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had been using these women, manipulating them for his own gain. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice hoarse. Because I'm done being his pawn, Leah said, her voice firm. And because I think you deserve to know the kind of man you're dealing with. When I got home, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house where my sons were playing inside. My chest ached, not just from Ethan's betrayal but from the realization that I'd been living with a stranger. Later that night, I sent him a text. We need to talk. Now. His reply came quickly. I'll come over in the morning. But I wasn't going to wait. When Ethan showed up the next day, I was ready. I laid Leah's words out in front of him like a prosecutor presenting evidence. He didn't deny it. Yes, I owe money, he admitted. A lot. I got in over my head with some bad investments. And you thought using other women was the solution? I spat. I didn't have a choice, he said, his voice breaking. I was trying to protect us, Mia. The kids. I thought if I could just fix it. You weren't protecting us, I interrupted. You were protecting yourself. Don't you dare try to frame this as noble. He looked at me, his eyes hollow. I don't know what to do anymore. For the first time, I saw him for what he truly was, not just a cheater, but a coward. A man who had let his fear and greed consume him, leaving devastation in his wake. And I knew then that I couldn't let him drag me, or our boys, down with him. Ethan slumped into the armchair across from me, his face a picture of defeat. He had just confessed to gambling away our financial stability, to spiraling into debt, and to using other women as lifelines in his sinking ship of lies. But I wasn't moved by his remorse. Not this time. You've been lying to me for years, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it carried the weight of my fury. Not just about the women, but about everything. How long, Ethan? How long have you been gambling? He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window as if the answer were out there. It started a few years ago. I thought it was harmless at first, just some bets with friends. But then. Then what? I demanded. Then it got out of control, he admitted. I made a bad investment at work, and I thought I could win it back. One thing led to another, and, he trailed off, his head falling into his hands. And you decided to gamble away our future? My voice cracked, tears threatening to spill. You decided to put me and the boys at risk so you could chase a quick fix. He looked up at me, his expression pleading. I thought I could fix it before you found out. I didn't want you to worry. Well, congratulations, I snapped. You've succeeded in making me worry about everything. For the next few days, Ethan stayed away, holed up in a hotel while I tried to process the mess he'd left behind. I combed through our bank accounts, credit card statements, and old records, uncovering a financial landscape I barely recognized. The savings account we'd built together was nearly empty. The joint credit card was maxed out. And there was a second, hidden card with charges I didn't recognize, luxury dinners, expensive gifts, even a payment to a jewelry store. I called my sister, Emily, in a panic. Ethan's been lying to me, I blurted out the moment she answered. What's going on, she asked, her voice filled with concern. Everything, I said, choking on a sob. He's been gambling. He's in debt. And he's been cheating on me. There was a long pause on the other end. Mia, she said finally, you need to talk to a lawyer. A few days later, Ethan showed up at the house, looking disheveled and defeated. We need to talk, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. You have 5 minutes. He stepped inside, his eyes darting around as if he were looking for a lifeline. I've been talking to a financial counselor, he began. They think bankruptcy might be the best option. I stared at him, stunned. Bankruptcy? How much debt are we talking about, Ethan? He hesitated, then muttered, close to $200,000. The number hit me like a freight train. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. How could you let this happen? I whispered. I was trying to protect you, he said again, as if repeating the lie would make it true. I shook my head, my hands trembling. Don't you dare. Don't you dare frame this as some noble sacrifice. You did this because you're selfish, because you couldn't admit you needed help. His shoulders sagged. You're right. I was selfish. I thought I could fix it on my own. And what about Leah and Sophia? I asked, my voice sharp. Were they part of your fix too? He winced, and for a moment, I thought he might try to defend himself. But then he said, I used them. I know it was wrong. I was desperate. You didn't just betray me, Ethan, I said, my voice shaking. You betrayed them too. And for what? To keep your secrets hidden a little longer? After Ethan left, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of documents in front of me. Bank statements, bills, and printouts of messages I'd collected from his phone. It was a mountain of evidence that painted a picture of a man I barely recognized. I called the financial counselor Ethan mentioned, pretending to be him. What I learned left me breathless. Ethan wasn't just in debt, he was in serious debt, and some of it wasn't even his own. Apparently, he'd co-signed a loan for someone else. When I pressed for more details, the counselor hesitated. He didn't tell you? Clearly not, I said through gritted teeth. It was for his brother, the counselor said. My jaw dropped. Ethan's brother, Michael, was a name that hadn't come up in years. They'd had a falling out shortly after our wedding, and I thought he'd been out of the picture ever since. That evening, I called Ethan. We need to talk. Now. He came over, his face lined with exhaustion. What is it? I held up the bank statements and the loan documents I'd discovered. Explain this. His face turned pale. Mia, I can explain. You co-signed a loan for Michael? Without telling me? I said, my voice rising. You've put us in debt for someone who hasn't even been in your life for a decade? He needed help, Ethan said weakly. He was going to lose his house. And now we might lose ours. I shouted. How could you do this, Ethan? How could you make these decisions without me? He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. I thought I was doing the right thing. You don't get to decide that on your own, I said coldly. You don't get to gamble with our lives and call it helping. As Ethan left that night, I realized something. I didn't just need to end my marriage, I needed to rebuild my life from the ground up. And that meant cutting Ethan out entirely. But as I began planning for the divorce, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more I didn't know. The morning after Ethan left, I called my lawyer, a calm and pragmatic woman named Claire who had handled a friend's divorce. Over coffee, I laid everything out, the affairs, the gambling, the debt, and the loan he co-signed for his estranged brother. Claire nodded as she took notes. You're right to be concerned, she said. You're married, which means all debts, including the ones he's taken on without your knowledge, are legally shared unless we take immediate action. My stomach churned. What kind of action? I'll start by filing for legal separation, she explained. That will protect you from any further financial entanglements. But Mia, she hesitated, then leaned forward. You need to prepare yourself. There may be more skeletons in his closet. That evening, as I tucked Jamie into bed, I felt the weight of her words pressing down on me. Every time I thought I'd reached the bottom of Ethan's deceit, the ground seemed to give way beneath me. I spent the next few days combing through our financial history, trying to piece together the puzzle Ethan had created. Each discovery made me feel like I was unraveling a stranger's life, not the man I'd shared a home with for over a decade. But it wasn't until a call came from an unfamiliar number that I realized just how deep his lies ran. Is this Mia? The voice on the other end asked. Yes. Who's this? My name is Natalie. I'm calling because I think we might have something in common. We met at a diner off the highway, a neutral spot that felt safe. Natalie was in her late 20s, with an air of nervousness that mirrored how I'd felt meeting Sophia and Leah. I'm sorry to bother you, she began, stirring her coffee. I didn't know who else to call. Ethan mentioned your name once, and I did some digging to find you. The mention of my name sent a chill down my spine. How do you know Ethan? Her lips pressed into a thin line. We were involved. A couple of years ago. My heart sank. A couple of years ago? This wasn't just recent, Ethan had been doing this for far longer than I'd realized. I had no idea he was married, she continued quickly. He told me he was divorced, with kids. But when I found out the truth, I broke things off. I swallowed hard, gripping my coffee cup. Why are you here now, Natalie? She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Because there's something you need to see. The folder was thick, stuffed with pages of printouts, receipts, and photographs. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at: wire transfers, contracts, emails with unfamiliar names. Then I saw Ethan's name scrawled across several documents, and a sinking realization hit me. What is this? I asked, my voice shaking. It's proof, Natalie said grimly. Ethan was involved in some questionable business deals. That's how I met him. I was working for one of the companies he invested in. Questionable how? She took a deep breath. The kind of deals that don't leave paper trails. Offshore accounts. Shell companies. Money laundering. I stared at her, my mind reeling. Are you saying Ethan was laundering money? Natalie nodded. I didn't know at first. But after I broke things off with him, I started piecing things together. And when I found out he'd been lying to me, I kept digging. My hands trembled as I flipped through the documents. Why are you telling me this now? Because if he's in trouble, and I think he is, you might be dragged into it too, she said. I thought you should know. That night, I barely slept. I spread the contents of Natalie's folder across the kitchen table, poring over the details she'd gathered. It was clear she'd done her homework: dates, account numbers, even emails between Ethan and potential business partners. But one name stood out among the others: Michael. Ethan's brother. I stared at the name, a knot forming in my stomach. If Michael was involved in this, then the loan Ethan had co-signed wasn't just a reckless decision, it was a calculated move. The pieces of the puzzle began to shift, forming a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. The next morning, I called Ethan. What now, Mia? He asked, his tone weary. You need to come over, I said curtly. We need to talk. I told you everything. Not everything, I snapped. And if you want to salvage even a shred of decency, you'll get over here now. When Ethan arrived, I didn't mince words. I threw the folder onto the table in front of him. Care to explain this? His face went pale as he thumbed through the documents. Where did you get this? Does it matter? I shot back. Is it true? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. It's not what it looks like. Don't lie to me, Ethan, I said, my voice rising. I've been lied to enough. Just tell me the truth for once. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Yes, it's true, he admitted. But I didn't mean for it to go this far. Why? I demanded. Why would you get involved in something like this? He looked up at me, his eyes hollow. Because Michael needed help. He got involved with the wrong people, and they were going to come after him. I thought I could fix it, but I just made it worse. You put our family in danger, I said, my voice trembling. For what? To save your brother? Tears welled in his eyes. I didn't know what else to do. I stared at him, the weight of his betrayal pressing down on me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just gambling or debt. It was a full-blown catastrophe. And I wasn't sure if I, or my boys, could survive it. Ethan sat slumped at the kitchen table, his face pale, his eyes hollow. I couldn't decide if I was more furious at him or at myself for still feeling something akin to pity. You've put our entire family in danger, I said, barely keeping my voice steady. Not just financially, Ethan. These people you're mixed up with, how far are they willing to go if you don't pay up? He shook his head, avoiding my gaze. I've tried to keep them away, Mia. That's why I've been cheating on me? Stealing from us? Gambling away what little stability we had? I snapped, cutting him off. You don't get to justify this, Ethan. Not anymore. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. You don't understand. I was trying to fix it. For all of us. No, Ethan, I said, leaning forward, my anger spilling over. You were trying to save yourself. And now we're all caught in your mess. After Ethan left, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the folder Natalie had given me. The weight of what I now knew felt suffocating. Ethan wasn't just a liar or a cheater, he was reckless. Dangerous. And I had no idea how deep his involvement ran. I needed answers. The next morning, I called Claire. We need to accelerate the separation, I told her. Claire's calm voice came through the line. I thought you might say that. But Mia, if there's criminal activity involved, this might go beyond a standard divorce. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? If Ethan is implicated in something illegal, any assets tied to both of you could be frozen during an investigation, she explained. You could be dragged into it, even if you had no involvement. The walls felt like they were closing in. So what do I do? We'll protect you as best we can, Claire said. But you need to be prepared. This might get worse before it gets better. I spent the next few days untangling my emotions from the cold, hard facts. My priority was clear: protect Ryan and Jamie at all costs. But as much as I tried to shield them from the storm, they were starting to notice the cracks. Is Daddy in trouble? Ryan asked one evening as I tucked him into bed. His wide eyes searched mine, and I realized how much he'd grown in the past year, how perceptive he'd become. No, sweetheart, I lied, brushing his hair back. Daddy and I are just figuring some things out. Are you mad at him? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, I said finally. But it's not your job to worry about that. Daddy and I love you and Jamie very much, and that's what matters. Ryan seemed satisfied with the answer, but as I left his room, I felt the weight of my own words pressing down on me. A few days later, Natalie called again. There's something else you should know, she said, her voice hesitant. I sighed, already bracing myself. What now? It's about Michael, she said. He's been making threats. My stomach dropped. Threats? Against who? Against Ethan. He's blaming him for everything, Natalie explained. I think he's trying to pin the entire operation on him. I gripped the phone tighter. Do you think he'd actually follow through? I don't know, Natalie admitted. But you need to be careful, Mia. If Michael feels cornered, there's no telling what he might do. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed Natalie's words over and over in my mind. Michael had always been a volatile presence in Ethan's life, a shadow that loomed over their childhood and into their adult years. But now, it seemed he was more than just a bad influence. He was a threat. And if Ethan couldn't, or wouldn't, deal with him, I'd have to. The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Michael. His voice was rough and impatient when he answered. "Who's this?" "It's Mia," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. There was a pause. "What do you want?" "I want to know what the hell is going on," I said. "I know about the loan. The money laundering. All of it. And I know you've been threatening Ethan." Michael laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Sounds like Ethan's been talking too much." "He's not the only one," I snapped. "I've seen the documents, Michael. I know you're as deep in this as he is." "Then you know I've got nothing to lose," he said, his voice hardening. "If Ethan's smart, he'll keep his mouth shut." "Leave him out of this," I said firmly. "And stay the hell away from me and my kids." There was a long silence, and then Michael said, "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Mia." After the call, I felt like I'd just walked into a lion's den. Michael wasn't just a loose cannon, he was dangerous. That night, I called Claire again. "We need to move fast," I told her. "I'm afraid this isn't just about money anymore." The next day, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Sophia, standing on my doorstep with a grim expression. "I need to talk to you," she said. I let her in, wary of what she might say. "I've been doing some digging of my own," she began. "And I think Ethan might be in more trouble than even he realizes." "What do you mean?" She pulled out a folder of her own, placing it on the table. "It's not just Michael. There's someone else pulling the strings." My blood ran cold as I flipped through the documents. Names and numbers swirled together, but one thing was clear: Ethan's problems weren't just his anymore. They were mine too. Sophia's folder sat between us on the table, its contents spreading like a disease through my already fragile sense of control. Each page I turned revealed something worse than the last: wire transfers to accounts in offshore banks, signed contracts that tied Ethan to shell companies, and names of individuals whose mere existence felt ominous. "What is all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's proof," Sophia said. "Ethan wasn't just working with Michael. He was working for someone else, someone bigger." "Who?" She hesitated, her expression grim. "A man named Victor. He's a financier, but not the legal kind. He launders money for people who don't want their business dealings to be traced." I stared at her, disbelief and dread washing over me. "And Ethan got involved with him?" Sophia nodded. "Michael introduced him. At first, it was just supposed to be a quick way to make money, moving funds through the company Ethan was working for. But then it grew. Victor started demanding more, and Ethan couldn't keep up." "Does Ethan know about this?" "He knows enough to be scared," she said. "And if Victor thinks Ethan's become a liability," she didn't finish the sentence, but I understood her meaning. That evening, I confronted Ethan. I waited until the boys were asleep, then called him over. When he arrived, I wasted no time. I threw the folder onto the coffee table, its incriminating contents spilling out. "Who is Victor?" I demanded. Ethan froze, his face going pale. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter," I snapped. "What matters is that you've dragged us into something dangerous. Tell me the truth, Ethan. All of it." For a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then he sank onto the couch, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "Victor's not someone you cross," he admitted. "Michael introduced us. I thought it was just a one-time deal, move some money, take a cut. But Victor doesn't let go. Once you're in, you're in. And now you're stuck," I said, my voice cold. Ethan nodded. "I've been trying to find a way out, but every time I think I'm free, he pulls me back in. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice cracking. I didn't want to put you and the kids in danger, he said, his eyes pleading. I thought if I could just fix it. You're delusional, I said, standing up. This isn't something you fix, Ethan. You've put all of us in harm's way. And for what? To save your brother? To line your own pockets? It wasn't like that, he protested. No? I snapped, pointing to the pile of documents. Because it sure looks like you were in this for yourself. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, his silence more damning than anything he could have said. The next day, I called Claire. Does this Victor have any legal claims over me or the boys? I asked. Claire hesitated. It's hard to say without knowing the full extent of Ethan's involvement. But if Victor feels threatened or betrayed, he may not care about legalities. Great, I muttered. What do I do? For now, focus on protecting yourself and the boys, she said. File for emergency separation. Make it clear that you're distancing yourself from Ethan and his actions. And if Victor comes after us? Then we'll involve the authorities, she said firmly. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. That evening, I began making preparations. I packed a bag for me and the boys, just in case we needed to leave quickly. I spoke to a neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, who promised to keep an eye on the house if things got dicey. But no amount of preparation could shake the sense of impending doom. 2 days later, Victor made his move. It was a quiet afternoon. Ryan was at a friend's house, and Jamie was napping. I was folding laundry when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, a man in a dark suit stood on the porch. His smile was cold, calculated. Mrs. Carter, he asked, his voice smooth. Yes? I'm a business associate of your husband's, he said, extending a hand. My name is Victor. My heart stopped. I didn't invite him in. Instead, I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me. What do you want? I asked, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. Victor's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm here to talk about Ethan. He's been delinquent in his obligations. Then talk to Ethan, I said coldly. I would, Victor said, his tone almost amused. But he seems to be avoiding me. So I thought I'd pay you a visit instead. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I have nothing to do with Ethan's business. If he owes you something, take it up with him. Victor's gaze sharpened, his smile fading. That's the thing, Mrs. Carter. When someone like Ethan runs out of options, they tend to get creative. I'm just here to make sure that creativity doesn't put anyone else in harm's way. Is that a threat? I asked, my voice rising. Not at all, he said smoothly. It's just a precaution. With that, he handed me a card. Tell Ethan to call me. Sooner rather than later. And then he was gone. As I watched Victor's car disappear down the street, my knees gave out, and I sank onto the porch steps. This wasn't just Ethan's mess anymore. It was mine. I sat on the porch steps long after Victor left, clutching the card he'd handed me like it was a live wire. His parting words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of just how deep Ethan had dragged us into his nightmare. By the time I went inside, Jamie was awake and calling for me. I tucked the card into a drawer, plastered on a smile, and scooped him up into my arms. How about some mac and cheese? I asked, trying to sound cheerful. But my mind was already racing, trying to figure out my next move. That night, I called Ethan. Victor came to the house today, I said as soon as he answered. There was a long silence. He what? Ethan's voice was a mix of shock and fear. He showed up unannounced, I said, my anger simmering beneath the surface. He told me to remind you to call him. And Ethan, he wasn't exactly subtle about what happens if you don't. Damn it, Ethan muttered. I didn't think he'd involve you. You didn't think, I snapped. That's the problem, Ethan. You never think. Now he knows where I live, where the boys live. How do I protect them if this escalates? I'll handle it, he said quickly. Like you've handled everything else? I shot back. Because if that's the plan, we're all screwed. There was a pause, and then Ethan said, Mia, you have to trust me. I laughed bitterly. Trust you? That's a joke, right? You've lied to me, cheated on me, gambled away our money, and now you've dragged us into this mess. Trusting you isn't an option anymore. The next day, I met with Claire again. He came to your house, she asked, her expression alarmed. Yes, I said, recounting the encounter. He's using me to get to Ethan. Claire nodded grimly. We need to file for an emergency protective order. It won't solve everything, but it will create a paper trail if Victor tries to intimidate you again. And if that doesn't work? I asked. Then we go to the authorities, she said. That afternoon, I packed up the boys and drove to my parents' house in a nearby town. I hadn't told them everything yet, only that Ethan and I were separating, but I knew it was safer there than at home. My dad, ever the protector, greeted us with open arms. You'll stay as long as you need to, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As I settled the boys into the guest room, I felt a small flicker of relief. At least here, we were out of Victor's immediate reach. 2 days later, Ethan called. I talked to Victor, he said. And? I asked, my voice cold. He's willing to give me more time, Ethan said. But I need to come up with the money. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. And how do you plan to do that? Gamble your way out? String along another woman? No, he said, his tone earnest. I'm selling everything, my car, my shares in the company, whatever it takes. Good, I said. But don't think for a second that this fixes anything between us. I know, he said quietly. But it might keep you and the boys safe. The following week passed in a blur. Ethan managed to scrape together a payment for Victor, but it was only a fraction of what he owed. Victor wasn't happy, but for the moment, the situation seemed to stabilize. I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Then, one evening, I received a call that changed everything. It was from Sophia. Her voice was shaky, panicked. Mia, something's happened. What is it? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. It's Ethan, she said. He's in the hospital. I arrived at the hospital an hour later, my heart racing. Sophia was in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. What happened? I demanded. He was jumped, she said. By 2 men. They left him in an alley downtown. Victor? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sophia nodded. It's a warning. I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. This was it. The point of no return. Ethan was conscious but battered when I saw him. His face was swollen, his arm in a sling. He looked up at me with a mixture of guilt and shame. I'm sorry, he said, his voice hoarse. Sorry doesn't cut it, I said, my tone sharp. This is what you've brought into our lives, Ethan. And I'm not going to let you drag the boys into it. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to protect my family, I said firmly. With or without your help. That night, as I drove back to my parents' house, a plan began to form in my mind. Ethan couldn't fix this, and neither could I, not alone. It was time to go to the authorities. The morning after visiting Ethan in the hospital, I sat at my parents' kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. My dad sat across from me, his eyes filled with quiet concern. You've been up all night, he said softly. I don't know what else to do, I admitted, my voice shaky. Ethan's gotten us in so deep, and I don't know how to protect the boys. My dad leaned forward, his hands clasped. You have to go to the police, Mia. This is bigger than you can handle on your own. I nodded, knowing he was right. But the idea of involving the authorities felt like opening Pandora's box. What if it made things worse? Still, I couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. Victor wasn't going to back down, and Ethan's debt wasn't going to disappear. That afternoon, I called Claire and told her my decision. 2 days later, I sat in a sterile room at the local police station, nervously twisting my hands as a detective named Ramirez took notes. "You've done the right thing by coming forward," he said after I'd recounted everything: Ethan's gambling, the money laundering, Victor's threats. "Will this keep Victor away from my kids?" I asked. Ramirez nodded. "We'll do everything we can to ensure your safety. But I need you to understand something: this could get messy. People like Victor don't take kindly to being investigated." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I knew there was no turning back. Over the next few days, the police worked quickly. They brought Ethan in for questioning, which he begrudgingly complied with. When he came out, he looked like a man who'd aged a decade in a single day. "What did they say?" I asked when we met at a cafe to discuss next steps. "They're building a case against Victor," he said. "But they want my help." "Your help?" He nodded. "They want me to wear a wire, gather evidence from Victor and his associates. They think it's the only way to take him down." My stomach churned. "And you agreed to this?" "What choice do I have?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with desperation. "If I don't, Victor will never stop coming after us." I looked at him, realizing how far he'd fallen, and how far he still had to go. "If you do this, you'd better do it right. Because if you screw it up, Ethan, it's not just you who will pay the price." The next few weeks were a blur of tension and fear. Ethan began working with the police, meeting with Victor while wearing a wire and feeding information back to the detectives. I stayed at my parents' house, keeping the boys close and avoiding any contact with Ethan outside of brief updates. Each day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, the sense of danger lurking just out of sight. Then, one evening, I got a call from Detective Ramirez. "We got him," he said, his voice triumphant. "What do you mean?" "We've arrested Victor and several of his associates," Ramirez explained. "Ethan's cooperation gave us what we needed to move forward." Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by exhaustion. "Does this mean it's over?" "For Victor, yes," Ramirez said. "But there's still the matter of Ethan's involvement. The DA will likely take his cooperation into account, but there's no guarantee he won't face charges." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. A week later, Ethan came to see me. His face was lined with stress, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I did it," he said, standing on my parents' porch. "Did what?" I asked, folding my arms. "I helped the police take down Victor," he said. "It's over, Mia. We're safe now." I studied him, unsure if I believed him, or if I could ever believe him again. "Safe doesn't mean everything's okay, Ethan. You still have to answer for what you've done." "I know," he said. "And I'm ready to face the consequences. I hope one day you can forgive me." I didn't respond. Forgiveness felt like a mountain I wasn't ready to climb. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Ethan was charged with several counts related to his involvement in Victor's operation, but his cooperation with the police earned him a reduced sentence. When the dust finally settled, I stood in a courtroom, watching as the judge handed down Ethan's sentence, 3 years in prison. He turned to me as he was led away, his eyes filled with regret. But I didn't look back. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild. The boys and I moved into a smaller house closer to my parents, and I started therapy to process everything that had happened. It wasn't easy, but slowly, I began to feel like myself again, a version of myself that was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect my family. One evening, as I tucked Jamie into bed, he looked up at me with his big, curious eyes. "Will Daddy come back?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. Someday, I said softly. But no matter what, you and Ryan will always have me. Jamie smiled and nestled into his pillow, and as I watched him drift off to sleep, I felt a flicker of hope. We had survived the storm. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, I knew we'd find our way. The first few months after Ethan's sentencing felt surreal. The chaos that had consumed my life for so long was finally gone, but in its place was a silence I wasn't sure how to fill. My days revolved around Ryan and Jamie, ensuring their lives stayed as normal as possible. Ryan threw himself into soccer, and Jamie, with his endless curiosity, peppered me with questions about the world. They were my anchors, their innocence a reminder of what I was fighting for. But the nights were harder. That was when the doubts crept in, the memories of what had been and the scars left behind. I lay awake more times than I cared to admit, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I'd missed the signs, how I'd let things spiral so far out of control. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The return address was from the state correctional facility where Ethan was serving his sentence. I stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. The letter was brief, written in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. Mia. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to give it. I've been doing a lot of thinking here, about you, the boys, and everything I've lost. I know I failed you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that, even if it's only in small ways. Please tell Ryan and Jamie that I love them. And thank you for being their rock. You're stronger than I ever deserved. I set the letter down, my emotions a tangled knot. There was no apology that could undo the damage he'd caused, but for the first time, his words felt genuine. Months turned into a year, and life slowly began to feel normal again. I got a new job working as an administrative assistant at a local nonprofit, a role that allowed me to be present for my boys while building something for myself. Ryan turned 11, and Jamie, ever the chatterbox, started school. They adapted better than I'd expected, their resilience a source of inspiration. But I knew the day would come when I'd have to tell them the full truth about their father. That day arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Ryan and Jamie were playing in the backyard when Ryan suddenly turned to me. "Mom, why hasn't Dad called?" he asked. I knelt beside him, brushing a stray leaf from his hair. "Your dad is away right now," I said carefully. "Is he in trouble?" Ryan asked, his eyes searching mine. I took a deep breath. "He made some bad choices, sweetheart. Choices that hurt a lot of people. But he's trying to fix them." Ryan frowned, processing my words. "Will we see him again?" "Someday," I said softly. "But for now, it's just us. And we're going to be okay." Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "Okay." In time, I learned to let go of the anger. Not for Ethan's sake, but for mine. Carrying the weight of his betrayal would only hold me back, and I refused to let it define the rest of my life. I focused instead on building a future for my boys, a future where they would know their worth and understand the importance of integrity and love. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jamie climbed onto my lap. "Are you happy, Mommy?" he asked, his small hands resting on mine. I smiled, kissing the top of his head. "I'm getting there," I said honestly. And I was. Because no matter how much the past had hurt, it had also taught me something invaluable. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. The chapter with Ethan was closed. But my story was far from over.